Hey, storyteller! We hear a lot about how to make readers fall in love with our characters, but what if you want the opposite to happen? What if you want readers to despise this character, but your story and that person's role in it don't really support going too dark? This is the exact dilemma one of my subscribers was facing recently. She wrote, "Can you make a video about how to make a hateful character, but one that's not too dark?" Apparently, she'd searched for a video on something like this and really couldn't find it. And my search didn't really yield better results. We can find a lot out there on how to make our protagonists unlikable or how to write villains. But what about those sort of in-between characters who readers can't stand this person, but they're not evil per se, or they're not acting as the main antagonist? Welcome to this week's writer coaching session, in which I'll share 9 tips on how to do just that. I'm Bridget from B Squared Writer Coaching, an author, editor, and your story coach, here to help you make your story powerful, polished, and publishable so you can move readers and help them experience your character's journey with maximum emotional impact. First, I have a gift for you just for visiting my channel: the real method to creating unforgettable characters. Making a character unlikable doesn't necessarily make him or her stand out. Whether you're focusing on your main character, your villain, or your supporting cast, this PDF will help you make them all stand out in 4 easy steps without needing to write boring character biographies. Just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com/real. That's the letter B, the number 2, writercoaching.com/real, REAL, and download your copy today. And be sure to stick around till the end of this video so you won't miss this week's Power Up, a super practical action step you can take right now in the story you're working on. Making a character unlikable is great, but which characters exactly are we talking about here? Are these tips I'm going to share strong enough for the actual villain of the story? Will they work if you're trying to write an unlikable protagonist? Well, you can use the tips I'm going to share for a milder main antagonist. This would be more like a rival or an obstacle standing in the protagonist's way rather than a true villain. Let's say the character is wanting to win a competition, or maybe 2 people are in love with the same girl and our protagonist is one of them, or they're vying for the same job, and the protagonist has certain lines that he or she would never cross, but our antagonist would cross some of those lines or would engage in some of these other tips we're going to share. This person isn't evil per se, but is not as aligned with the reader's values as our protagonist may be. We can also use these tips for a secondary character or minor character who is causing conflict or problems for our protagonist. This could also be an ally of the protagonist, someone who is maybe more morally gray than the protagonist or would do things the protagonist never would, but the protagonist needs this person's help for some reason, or maybe this person is a family member or a sidekick, someone who even could get on the protagonist's nerves at times and be really annoying, but our main character really has no choice but to put up with this person either because they're related or circumstances have thrown them together, or like I said, they need this person's help in some way. And yes, some of these tips could work if you are trying to write an unlikable protagonist as well. Just keep in mind that an unlikable protagonist will need some kind of, if not a redemption arc, at least a transformation toward the better by the end of the story, or that character needs to cause such a transformation in others. Otherwise, the reader may feel like, what was the point of this story? I'm reading about a character I really don't like, and nobody changed for the better, then why did I waste my time? So we want to make sure we are showing some kind of transformation if you use this for your protagonist. Since we have 9 tips, I've grouped them into 3 categories, and for the most part, we'll go from less dark to darker in each of the categories. This first group of tips will focus on how we can make our character unlikable in relation to others. Probably the most common trait of unlikable characters is self-focus. This can be true selfishness or bratty or spoiled type behavior, or just this character is simply clueless as to the needs and wants and feelings of those around him. If you've seen my video on how to write a compelling villain without condoning evil, which I'll link here and also in the description, I touched on this a lot in that video on how a villain's true goal is the self, This can also be true for just an unlikable character. Closely related to that is tip number 2. Show this character having no filters. He says what he thinks and doesn't care who it hurts or upsets or how anyone feels about it. This character lacks compassion or empathy, or maybe both. A good example of this would be actually an unlikable protagonist, the main character in As Good as It Gets, played by Jack Nicholson. He really didn't care how people felt about his opinions. He just said what he thought, and you just had to deal with it. And the third tip in this category is to show our character taking pleasure in either witnessing or causing the distress of others. This character may be grumpy much of the time and cause other people aggravation just because, hey, if I have to be in a bad mood, so should you. After all, misery loves company, right? Just be careful not to take this too far. Though the character may take pleasure or at least feel some satisfaction when other people are miserable along with him, we don't want to go too far or too dark with this. This isn't a sadistic torturer by any means. If you want a character like that in your story, go for it. But that's not exactly what we're talking about today. We're just kind of talking about the milder version of that. This brings us to our second group of tips, in which we will give our character an unlikable personality. To do this, we can give our character a negative trait in terms of temperament. Maybe this character has zero patience or tolerance for anyone else. He's angry much of the time, as I said earlier, just grumpy, flies off the handle for no apparent reason. Or maybe this character is very condescending toward others. And closely related to that condescending character, we can make this person not only arrogant, but judgmental, and at the same time refuse to see his or her own flaws. This character may feel the need to put others down in order to make himself or herself feel worthy or superior or just less insecure. I don't know about you, but I've known several people like this in my life, and they can make the world miserable for other people. Let's look at the movies. I'm thinking in particular of a film version of Pride and Prejudice starring Keira Knightley. The character of Lady Catherine was very condescending toward others and would sniff and turn up her nose if, let's say, for example, she asked Elizabeth, Keira Knightley's character, if she knew how to play the piano, and Elizabeth said only a little and she wasn't that great at it. Lady Catherine sniffed at that, yet later on you find out that Lady Catherine herself never learned to play the piano. So she's looking down at someone else for not being able to do something well when she can't do that thing at all. This type of character can be quite destructive to someone else's self-esteem, especially if he or she is that person's love interest or an authority figure in that person's life, like a parent, a teacher, or someone else, a coach. And the final tip in this category is to give our character a mindset or belief system that most of us would find repugnant, such as racism, gender bias, or any other prejudice that demeans the worth of someone else based on an arbitrary set of standards that really have nothing to do with worth. Are you finding this helpful so far? If so, please consider clicking the like button so YouTube will show this video to other writers like you. Thanks in advance. Now, our third set of tips is related to showing our character taking unlikable action. To do this, you can brainstorm behaviors, attitudes, and actions that truly annoy you. For example, a character who is whiny or a person who complains all the time. Maybe that relative who's always looking for a handout, someone who is lazy or refuses to try. Maybe this person's a control freak or constantly tells lame jokes and just won't stop and doesn't get the hint that nobody wants to hear this stuff. Maybe this person interrupts others constantly. One of those traits could be a quirky or annoying laugh, though be a little careful with this. I wouldn't use that by itself because people can't always control what their laugh sounds like. So try to make this trait something that is a point of decision for the character. This person can control it, but just chooses not to. Otherwise, you may end up creating empathy for this character in the reader. Whatever the trait is, you can give one or more of those to your character, and that, along with some of these other tips, can make this character quite unlikable. One character who comes to mind for this one would be Mr. Collins from that same Pride and Prejudice film. He had this annoying habit of thinking that other people wanted to hear him read sermons in his monotone voice, or thinking that his little compliments or little delicacies, as he called them, that he would try to use to flatter people really were desirable. And he would rehearse this stuff beforehand, and it always sounded forced or kind of condescending, actually. And he was clueless. He just didn't get it. But these behaviors were quite annoying to the characters and to the reader as well. Or, well, the viewer, I guess, in this case, since it was a film. Another character who comes to mind is Professor Umbridge from the Harry Potter series. This was a character that the subscriber who brought up this topic referenced. However, I would consider Umbridge actually to be quite dark, since she basically indulged in what amounts to child abuse and a form of torture, really, in how she treated her students. But if we weren't thinking about that, she did have some rather annoying behaviors as well. Her tendency to sort of clear her throat and try to get someone's attention because she wanted the spotlight, she'd say. Or she had this little girly laugh, and this is a pretty sadistic woman who has this little girly laugh. Another thing, it's more of, I guess, an incongruency in terms of her personality, is that she had these pictures of cute kittens and all this lace and pink wallpaper in her office, very girly, almost little girl type decorations in her office, and yet she was quite mean-spirited and horrible. She also had what would pretty much amount to racist beliefs, in that she discriminated against or had a huge prejudice against anyone who was what she would call part human, which included centaurs, werewolves, who are some characters in the Harry Potter series, and also against those who were not fully wizards or descended from wizards. So she had quite a few of these traits, actually. If you removed the sadistic behavior, then she could just be considered unlikable. But because she basically tortures her students, I think she goes beyond that. For the second tip in this category, we can show this character taking actions or crossing lines that our protagonist never would cross. This character is not afraid to embrace questionable behaviors and actions, take shortcuts, like cheating, for example. Maybe the two characters are rivals in a competition, and this milder antagonist, so to speak, has no problem cheating to win or sabotaging the other competitors in order to win. Another use of this tip would be to show a character who has no problem creating a flawed or substandard product and putting it out on the market, despite the fact that whatever it is he's creating could either cause harm or just not work right and cost the customer just as much or more than whatever our protagonist is creating, and yet it's a waste of money for our customer because it doesn't work. Whereas our protagonist takes pride in his or her work and would never try to cheat a customer or deliver faulty goods. And the third tip in this category is to brainstorm actions you would love to take, sometimes in retaliation for hurt or someone else doing something terrible to you, but these are things you would never actually do. You can show this character doing those things and having absolutely no remorse over it. Maybe this character tells someone off in a pretty vicious way, like he knows just the buttons to push to make that person feel small and says exactly what he'd like to say at that moment. I'm thinking of the movie You've Got Mail. Meg Ryan's character was far from unlikable, but there were several moments where she just got tongue-tied when she was facing an enemy, so to speak, the character who was her rival in the retail industry, and she told a friend that she really wished she could say the thing she would think of later in the moment that happened. Well, an occasion arises where she does, and it makes him feel super small, and she hits the bullseye, and then she feels horrible about it afterward. The reason she's so likable is because she does feel horrible about it afterward. And because this is not her normal behavior, she normally can't think of those things in the moment, and if she did, wouldn't say them. But this time she did. She had been pushed to the breaking point, and then she felt guilty. Our unlikable character would never feel guilty about it and would be thrilled that he or she had done this. And I have a surprise bonus tip for you. The more of these traits or tips that you use and combine, and the greater the impact this character's behavior or actions would have on our protagonist or the other lovable characters in your story, the more the reader will despise this character. So if you want to really make this person unlikable, combine some of these tips and make those actions and behaviors affect the protagonist or another character the readers love in a really negative and profound way. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to download your real method to creating unforgettable characters. Remember, just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com/real to grab your copy. For this week's Power Up, we're going to make a few lists. First, consider the character you want to make unlikable. Let's write his or her role or purpose in the story, how he or she relates to or affects the protagonist, and exactly why you want him or her to be unlikable in the story. How does that unlikability serve the story? Then brainstorm this character's motivations as they relate to his or her place or role in the story. Use the tips in this video to brainstorm actions and behaviors, even dialogue you can use in order to make this character unlikable. While brainstorming, get as specific as possible. So particular actions, not just, oh, I want to show this character being condescending. Try to think of to whom will he be condescending, or how will that condescension affect the person it's aimed at. This will give you a great start on making your character unlikable or even hateful, as my subscriber wanted to do for her character. In one of the tips I shared today, I mentioned that we could create a character who interrupts others constantly. That's pretty unlikable, right? But how can we effectively show that on the page? Check back for next week's writer coaching session when we'll tackle interruptions, trailing speech, and other dialogue quirks that can ramp up our characters' conversations. And be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss it. And if you'd like to watch my video on how to create compelling villains, the one that prompted this whole discussion, check it out right here. And in the meantime, let's power up your storytelling.